everyone, ErikOnPaper here, and in case you hadn't figured it out, I'm Erik. So we're going to be doing something a little bit different than my traditional coloring videos in that this is a look at digital coloring. And to do that, I will use the Supergirl piece that I drew while getting an infusion at the hospital. And this is actually, to be fair, a revision of the drawing. The original, I did a terrible job trying to ink with a brush pen while getting an infusion. So don't rush your work and definitely take the time to redo it, is the big moral of that. So to briefly talk about my inking while I'm going through this, I went back in and realizing I was going to color the piece digitally instead of with Copics and colored pencils. I opted to use thinner lines, never going above a micron 0.3 for my result. And also I drew this on an 8x11 Bristol board, and when you're drawing on a smaller surface, or smaller canvas I should say, I tend to find that using the thicker markers like the 0.5, the 0.8, and definitely the 1, gives it a lot more of a coloring book feel, and I mean you could like that and go for that. There is no real rules with art and rendering. This is all a personal preference, and especially when I'm doing a piece that is going to be digital, I tend to want to keep the lines really thin and still giving line weight and variation and details as needed. But still, I try to keep it thin so the digital coloring can show itself off. Also, I grew up loving and reading a lot of 90s comics, and that really influenced my art style, so that's why I try to have as many render lines as I can, but without going overboard, because when you're rendering the female figure in particular, there's a tendency to have too many lines make them look older and not necessarily age appropriate, and considering that this is Supergirl, I kept most of my detailing to her costume with only slight render lines on her face. But this tutorial really isn't about inking, it's about digital coloring, which we're going to get into now. So the first thing I did was flat this, and I'm not going to go into flatting. There are far better tutorials on it, and flatting is essential but very tedious work. It's kind of like the Toby Flenderson of the comic coloring industry if you're a fan of The Office. But I was taught to paint in using light, so that's why I make my flats very dark. And I set my brush or gradient tool. I use the brush pretty much entirely for this piece, with a few exceptions. Now my style of rendering, and of course there are many styles, like a more cel-shaded or more geometric styling, but what I like to do is use the lasso tool to grab an area, and then turn up the feather of the lasso, and then use the brush around the edges just to let the feather and the softness of the brush fill in the details. In particular on Supergirl, I don't want to give her too many hard edges to give her a younger appearance. And the way I like to color is section by section, meaning if I'm coloring in her flesh tones, then I'm going to stick with that on the piece until I'm done. In particular, these highlights. I'm going to go in and make this a sunrise/sunset scene, and what I'm doing here with my color selection is just filling it in with the oranges, off-white tones. When you're picking your colors to use with the screen mode for your brush or gradient tool, you don't want too much white in there, otherwise the whole thing will look really milky and not look nearly as appealing to the eye, especially when it goes to print. And I'm going to talk about how we're going to check color saturation later. And a little tip there, this is used in a lot of Renaissance paintings, and I learned this recently in school just to get this more painterly effect, is to add an exclamation mark on the character's nose. It's an old technique from classical painting, but I think it just adds a little something special to the piece. Now doing your lips, select a color that isn't too milky, like I said earlier, and also is able to be reproduced by printing. There's a little box with an exclamation mark that appears that lets you know if it's in illegal color ranges.
Personally, I find that term hilarious, but I'm not going to fight against it. Adding some highlights as needed. Now moving on to her eyes, we're going to add in highlights and give it depth. Now, never go pure white with the eyes. It's okay to go off-white, but pure white will just print as pure white, and it's good to have some color in there, even if it's slight. And as light as I go here in the eyes is still not pure white, but the eyes are the most important features of the face, and you really want them to stand out. Now here, just using the lasso tool again, I'm selecting particular parts of her hair that are going to be hit by the light coming in on the right side, well, her right side, the left side of the drawing, and just fill it in for some highlights. Now, one thing I learned is that even if you intend on giving something a specific color, like, oh, we want a slightly orange cast, since your brush is in screencast, it's critical that you adjust your color in the color picker that best complements the flat that you're painting on top of. Like now here, I tried a color for the cape that I initially didn't like, but I edited that out to make myself look cooler, but then I went in with more orange and not a literal red, because reds are some of the hardest things to get right in comics, consistency and rendering. And even with the cape here, I didn't want to flat red onto red, so I went with the darker red on the interior of the cape so it would contrast with her skirt and with her boots. But just getting to know the forms and where you want highlights and where they'll look best, and consider where the light is coming from. And also what would make your image really pop. And like there, I think I went way too intense with that highlight, so just step backward and turn it down. And just going in and adjusting the feathers, making sure that the material on her boot is rendered differently than the fabric of her skirt and the cloth of her cape. I think that it's Kryptonian cloth or something special. I'm not exactly sure, but feel free to correct me in the comments. I just know you will. So now we're going into rendering specific areas, complementing with the line art, like the folds, but you don't want it to look too plasticky. And here, I think with the cape, I use the gradient tool just a little bit because I thought it was a bit too intense at first, and I just used the gradient tool and actually even just the brush on top of that to give it some more depth. And up here, adding another highlight to make things pop, even if it's not 100% realistic. If it makes your image look good, I say do it. So now my selection here, as you can see, that's what I was talking about with your color picker. Adding in those highlights, and we'll add that orange cast in later, and there I forgot to use the mask properly, but fixed it. This is your chance to add a lot of dimensionality to your piece, and also use your mask properly, like we don't want the blue bleeding into her emblem. Now as you're working through these shapes and figuring out where the highlights go, keep in mind that you're going to want to plan ahead for a secondary light to come in as kind of a rim light, and this gives a lot more dimension and modeling to your shapes, and break everything down to simple shapes like cylinders, circles, looking at an anatomical reference as much as possible if that's your style and you're going for a realistic look. But keep in mind that the eye is attracted to brighter areas, so what you're doing is trying to guide the eye to the most important parts of the image. In the case of a pinup where you're not actually telling a story, I try to give as much attention as possible to the face, because that's where the character's expression lies, obviously, but also the heart and soul of what people can connect to. And going in with the emblem to correct it, light it in a manner that matches the rest of the art. Like if there's a highlight in the blue, for example, make sure it matches with the reds and yellows. And since I wanted the belt to have a metallic look, I went with a big highlight and a slightly reflected light. And I just did a basic gradient for the background, nothing too fancy because I want her to stand out. And now we're going in with the purple, that's a secondary light, and testing it against the background. And you're going to see it pop into black and white, and that's not a glitch. What I like to do is have a hue saturation layer and see how bright I can push the colors to create depth and create interest in the image. Naturally, the brighter it goes, the more variance you have. If you have an image that is just grays or muted throughout, the mistake I made in my earlier coloring was to try to color in the shadows. And you can do that in certain occasions. Of course, there are no absolute rules in art, but sometimes when printing them or having them printed, I would notice that the colors looked muddy and flat, and I kept wondering why that was, and eventually I learned more to paint the light instead of painting these shadows. And here, just using secondary shadows to go in and add highlights, details, and things like that to the shapes. And what it does is it helps distinguish and pop it out from the background and give the figure more depth. Like the closest thing to the camera or to us would be her left leg. And the shadow underneath her leg, I feel, does that. But you can also enhance that with the coloring too. And technically I broke a rule here. What you should always try to do is color in the background first, and then place your character in the scene. It gives everything a more cohesive and realistic feel. I, being impatient AF, just jumped ahead and started working on the figure, knowing I would put a sunset, and let's go with sunset. I was debating on sunrise or sunset, but somehow sunset seems a little more dramatic. I knew I wanted that behind her, so that's how I started, but if your client or the scene in a script or something like that has a specification for a time of day, pay attention to that first and then incorporate that. Now the purple I'm using here in the hair is a little bit different than the one I've been using on the rest of her body, and that's just to complement the yellow color more. And this is adding more highlights to the hair, but because you're using cooler color, it's implying shadow more. And here I did an experiment, and it first came out a little too saturated, but eventually I smoothed it out. Now we're going to be moving on to her skin, and the cooler colors give it a more shadowy feel, even though technically I'm not adding any shadows to it. I'm just using the same screen brush. And your eye reads it as a shadow because the colors are cooler. And this is a really interesting illusion that I learned, but I'm really happy to have. And areas where I've indicated hatching for the darks in an image, well, that's just where you put the shadow or cool colors in an image. And it really helps it pop and give it life, while at the same time not calling too much attention, I feel. And as I said, when you're rendering particular female form, you want to emphasize the curves in it. If that is the style, I should say. You can draw however you want. And now when it comes to adding the secondary color, like what I did there, you can go in and add it and then draw a mask on the inside and go in with some additional coloring to create a highlight even within the shadows. It's a cool effect, but like all effects and gimmicks, use it sparingly so it actually has an impact. Now here, rendering carefully along the shapes, because you don't want her to look too removed from reality. Just focusing enough and going a bit minimally here to get the point across that this is in shadow, but this isn't too heavily, like this isn't like nighttime, of course. And also with your color scheme, and this is more just a note on artistic philosophies, I try to think of what I'm trying to communicate with this character in this moment. because technically if you just flatted the image, it's done. You've done a coloring job. And you can match the light source and add some highlights and shadows, but I try to think about what I want this character to say. And I see Supergirl as an optimistic character, so I wanted just a message of hope. And there, switching between the black and white to try to get the values and shades that I want. And that should be it for this tutorial. Thank you for watching. I will be posting some more Spider-Man 4 content soon for all those fans, as well as doing some other personal projects that I'm really looking forward to showing you. So like and subscribe and keep telling your stories.